In today's lesson, we'll be learning about slope-intercept form. As discussed previously, a linear relation is really just a pattern, and it can be represented with the equation y equals ROCx plus IV, where ROC is the rate of change, and IV is the initial value. This equation, which you should be very familiar with at this point, is the exact same thing as y equals mx plus b. Instead of rate of change, we have the variable m. M represents slope. Instead of initial value, we have the variable b, and that represents the y-intercept. And this is why it's called slope-intercept form. But keep in mind that these two equations are exactly the same. In our first example, we have an equation y equals 2x plus 5. We need to determine the slope and the y-intercept just by looking at this equation. If you remember, slope, which is represented with the variable of m, is the same thing as a rate of change, and that is the number directly in front of the variable of x. Therefore, the slope is 2. The y-intercept, which is represented by the variable of b, is the exact same thing as initial value, and that is the number at the end of this equation. That would be positive 5. I'm not going to write the positive sign in, however. Therefore, the slope is 2 and the y-intercept is 5. In our second example, we have the equation y equals negative 2x minus 5. We need to determine the slope and the y-intercept just by looking at the equation. If you remember, slope is the same thing as rate of change. The slope here would be the number directly in front of the variable of x, and that would be negative 2. Meanwhile, the y-intercept, which is the exact same thing as the initial value, would be the number at the end of this equation, and it would be negative 5. It is important to pay special attention to the signs, as both the slope and y-intercept includes the sign in front of it. Therefore, the slope is negative 2 and not just 2, while the y-intercept is negative 5 and not just 5. In our third example, we have the equation y equals 2 over 3x subtract 5. We need to determine both the slope and y-intercept just by looking at this equation. If you remember, the slope is the same thing as rate of change, and that is the number in front of the variable of x. In this particular situation, it would be a fraction. It would be 2 over 3. Meanwhile, the y-intercept, which is the same thing as the initial value, would be the number at the end of the equation, and this would be negative 5. It is important to pay special attention to the signs here, as the y-intercept includes the sign in front of it. Therefore, the slope is 2 over 3 and the y-intercept is negative 5 and not just 5.